Chapter 8, Part 2, No One Can Change It. An overcast sky blanketed Kakariko Village, but Zelda was thankful for the lack of rain. Cuckoos clucked in a small pen where a sweet woman tended to them as Zelda passed, and the windmill sitting atop the hill slowly turned in the wind. She was on her way to the graveyard, where the Shadow Temple lurked. Impa had taken a young Zelda to Kakariko several times, but always avoided the graveyard. Royal family members were buried there, as well as other esteemed residents of Hyrule. Whether it was the danger of the graveyard itself or the temple, Zelda wasn't sure why Impa hadn't brought her back there. Either way, her heart beat a tad faster as she moved closer. She walked through a narrow passageway and was greeted with a wide expanse of gravestones spread across the lawn. A small shack sat to the right, and she was surprised to find someone moving through the grave markers. A hunched, balding man with a shovel on his back. She hesitated, unsure of precisely where the temple was located. Perhaps she should ask this odd character, who she surmised must be the gravekeeper.
"Excuse me,"
she said as Sheik. The man ducked behind a gravestone, shielding his head with the shovel. "Who goes there?" he shouted, obviously paranoid. "I'm armed, you know."
I'm not going to hurt you, sir."
She saw his beady eyes peek above the gravestone. "Then what do you want?" She raised her hands in surrender.
"Just to find the temple that lies guarded in this place.
She explained.
I must enter it."
He finally stood, still clutching his shovel. "Well, that's ironic," he spat. "A Sheikah entering the Shadow Temple? Ha!" Zelda furrowed her brow in concern. Was this man a Civil War sympathizer? She couldn't read him, so she kept a ways back just in case.
"Perhaps it doesn't make sense to you, sir, but it's my desire to find the temple. Will you tell me where it is?"
He began to hobble toward her, and she tensed. This man seemed unpredictable. But instead of doing something insane, he stuck out his hand for her to shake. "Nothing really makes sense here," he said. "I'm Dampe." She cautiously shook his hand and watched as he pointed his shovel toward the back of the graveyard, where a high ledge and a fence blocking it hid in the shadows. "Back there, that's your temple. But just so you know, you can't traverse it unless you've got the magic eye." Zelda had no idea what he meant by the magic eye. Did he mean the sight? Like what Granny had? Dampe chuckled. "I can see you don't even know what I'm talking about. You look parched. I'll make you some tea and tell you all about it." He limped over toward the shack, and Zelda hesitantly followed him, completely bemused. She hoped this gravekeeper had good information and wouldn't be wasting her time. They entered the shack, and Zelda had to squeeze her small frame into it. They barely fit, the both of them, and she immediately felt claustrophobic. But Dampe went about making her tea like he said, on a tiny stove in the corner. While he filled the kettle from a jug of water, he began to explain. "Long ago, before the war even, a man lived in a house right where Kakariko's well sits now. He owned an artifact that was said to see the truth of everything, even people and their thoughts. But that was just a rumor. What that artifact really saw was what remained unseen to the human eye. There are supposedly walls of illusion and invisible enemies lurking in the temple, and if you don't have the magic eye, you risk losing yourself in there or getting killed by nothing." He handed Zelda a steaming wooden cup. "Whatever it is or wherever it came from, that man became addicted to its powers. The Shadow Temple was blocked off back then, and he wanted so badly to get inside and traverse its horrible walls that he dug a deep hole right in the center of his house to build a tunnel to the entrance. Instead of getting inside, he ran into the darkest, most evil creatures known to Hyrule on the way and succumbed to their attacks. Creatures that only live under the earth. No one knows what exactly killed him, But when he was found, his body was torn up like a beast had gotten to it. Ripped from limb to limb he was. Zelda sat transfixed. She hadn't even taken a sip of her tea yet. The people who found him, they took that magic eye and went to hide it deep within that well he built. But of course, they never came back out. The people of Kakariko filled it with water so no one else could go down there, and they burned down that tainted house. But that hasn't stopped people from trying. You're proof of that. Her throat felt dry, so she finally took a sip and winced at the bitterness.
So, is there no way to obtain this magic eye then?
Dampé full-on laughed, his belly shaking. After all that, you still want to get inside that temple, eh? You're just as wacky as that dead man. Zelda took a steady breath. She had to stop feeling so reactive when she was accused of being insane. After all, she'd thought this man was insane, but it seemed he had more sense than most.
I must, Dampé. In fact, I've already traversed the water, fire, and forest temples. I have a mission.
And what mission might that be?
I'm sorry, but I cannot tell you.
Dampé regarded her with narrowed eyes and tilted his head. You seem like a determined lad. I'll give you that. He tapped his fingers on his cup, then downed his tea in one gulp. All right then, I'll help you get down to well. But only if you tell me one thing first.
I'll do my best.
He leaned forward in earnest. What's something you regret? Doing or not doing? Zelda frowned. What an odd question to ask. I tend to the dead, lad. Sometimes the poe spirits that haunt this graveyard speak to me, and you know what they always talk about? How much they regret in life. Not in death, in life. You only get one, and if you're lucky, you don't get trapped in some sort of limbo. If you regret anything, you ought to know what it is and why, and then you ought to fix it if you can, before you can't. She was beginning to like this gravekeeper. He seemed to have a sound philosophy, like Impa, though his delivery was quite different.
I suppose it's the things I cannot change that I regret the most,
she answered.
The people I've hurt. I wish I could take it all back.
The sages, Link, her father, Impa, and Rovin. Zelda hadn't used or even looked at the compass he'd gifted her. Her guilt was too strong. If only she could change what she'd done to him. You can't go back in time, lad. Zelda almost burst out laughing at that statement. But you can make up for the hurt you've caused. All it takes is a little death of your pride. The inside of the windmill felt like some sort of carnival ride. If Zelda were to step on the wooden platform, she'd go spinning and spinning. It made her dizzy just looking at it. Dampé had led her in here, in order to drain the well, he'd said. How a windmill was to do that, she couldn't figure out. But she had been pleasantly surprised by the gravekeeper's sensibilities thus far. So she followed him, clinging to hope. The operator's on break, Dampé told her, maneuvering around the spinning platform in a surprisingly nimble way. You'd never drain it for us willingly. We gotta do this quick-like.
Are you sure we should then? I don't want you to get in any trouble, Dampé.
He reached for something Zelda couldn't see near the floor and against the east wall. She craned her neck, but could only see him grasp some sort of lever. Don't you concern yourself for me. You'll just fill it back up again later. Don't worry, I'll make him wait till you're out. He chuckled and pushed forward with all of his weight, and Zelda watched as the platform attached to the windmill's blades outside spun even faster. She backed away toward the door, ready to bolt. What if the mechanism came apart? Dampé waited a good 30 seconds before pulling the lever back toward him, and Zelda sighed with relief as the windmill slowed down to its original speed. He ambled toward her, motioning for her to open the door and step out. Down the stairs he led her and over to the well, which was now as good as empty, and dark. unpleasantly dark. "There you are," he said triumphantly. "Now, make sure you're well equipped before you go down there. And don't say I didn't warn you." He turned to leave.
Wait,
"Lad?" Zelda wasn't sure what she wanted to say, as she was distracted by her gratitude towards him and her fear of the well's depths. She settled on curiosity.
what do you regret?
She asked. Dampé smiled wide. "That's the beauty of tending graves, lad. You get so used to the idea of death. Life is full of possibilities. Not regret. Certainly you can see it that way. The closer you'll be to fixing things." Zelda smiled as the gravekeeper winked at her and limped away, back to his gravestones, his tiny shack, and his simple life. Odd or not, the man certainly had a gift for inspiring. She turned toward the well, took a deep breath, and descended the ladder into the deep darkness within. Absently wondering where all of the water had drained to, Zelda summoned a bit of light magic in order to brighten her surroundings. The earthy walls dripped, and a stagnant cold seeped into her limbs, even though she'd only been down there for a few minutes. She crept along the passageway, inching forward, her eyes scanning every surface until she came to a dead end. Her chest filled with dread as the light she emitted settled over a skeleton lying prone against the wall in front of her. Was this the man who originally owned the magic eye? Dampé said he'd been ripped apart, but this skeleton was fully formed. Was this yet another victim of the well's dangers? She desperately searched around her for a pathway to follow, but there was only this dank hall and the deceased. She thought hard. What had Dampé said about illusory walls? Skeptical, she reached her hand forward to touch the dripping surface, but her hand went straight through it. She gaped with wonder as she stepped through the facade, feeling absolutely nothing as she did so. It was just an illusion. No wonder it was so easy to become lost in this place. The room resembled a square-shaped passage, and she could hear odd noises coming from the other side where she couldn't see. Whatever it was came closer and closer. Her heart leapt out of her chest as the source of the noise zoomed around the corner. A huge skull, wreathed in green flames, bobbing through the air. Zelda drew her weapon, ready for a fight with this odd and terrifying creature. But it simply floated on past her, paying her no mind at all. She watched as it rounded the next corner and continued on its way. As she suspected, it circled the entire room. The next time it passed, she bolted right and shimmied into an alcove where the floor fell out from beneath her feet, and Zelda screamed in terror as she plunged downward, with only seconds to wonder if she would survive it. She hit the ground hard. Unmoving, she winced and tried to assess the damage, if any. Her wrists hurt from breaking the fall with her hands, and her right hip felt bruised at the very least. Thankfully, as she slowly tested each limb, she determined that everything else seemed to be in working order. She stood herself up, panting. Already, she'd been thrown into chaos, and it hadn't been 10 minutes since entering the well. But at least she'd made it farther than that skeleton. Her light magic had gone out, so she reignited it, only to find 3 redeads blocking her path. They hadn't yet noticed her, quietly moaning to themselves, and Zelda's heart boomed with terror as she tried to assess how she could navigate through them without being spotted or strangled. Redeads, according to Impa, were long-deceased humans whose souls had moved on, but their earthly bodies were reclaimed by an untold magic. They killed without mercy, able to freeze their prey in their tracks for a time. But why were they down here? Perhaps they'd bled into the well from the temple, but they were creatures that required an outside source of magic to control. which meant the royal family must have deigned to practice this necromancy. Her head buzzed with the implications, but she focused in. She needed to get out of this. What had Impa taught her? Something about freezing them back, using their own power in a different way, a way only the living could. A song. She pulled out the goddess harp, careful to make little noise. She needed to remember the notes exactly. Couldn't risk playing them wrong and catching the attention of the monsters. It was a simple song, one that called in light and joy, an ascension of tones. She squeezed her eyes shut in panic and plucked the strings. 3 notes in succession and repeated. A terrible stretching sound reverberated throughout the small corner in which she stood. She opened her eyes to see the 3 redeads had turned pale and were frozen to the spot. Zelda wasted no time. She bolted, throwing herself through an unlocked door. A large chest sat in the center of the next room, and as she opened it, she marveled at the treasure inside. Magic eye, indeed. The artifact resembled a magnifying glass, but was styled like the Sheikah eye symbol, a sacred icon of the people. She brought it to her face and watched as one of the walls in the room disappeared, revealing a long tunnel that seemed to angle upward toward the surface. Taking the passage all the way to its end, she glanced up to see what looked like a stone slab blocking the way. She pushed it with every ounce of strength she had, and it slid to the side, allowing daylight to spill into the underground. Hope filled her dampened heart at the sight, but before she could climb out into the tantalizing light, she heard something behind her. A soft rumbling. Zelda gasped in terror as she looked. A smoky, amorphous shape was making its way to her. It made a searing, screeching sound, and just before it reached her, she jumped up and grasped the earth to pull herself out. She scrambled out of the hole, taking a deep breath of the fresh air and realizing she was back in the graveyard. The stone slab had been a gravestone. Launching herself away from the hole, she stared, expecting to see the strange substance funnel itself out to chase her. But instead, it seemed to be squished against the opening, as though there were an invisible barrier that kept it beneath the ground. It screeched again, seemingly in anger, and then retreated back to whatever hovel in which it lived. Zelda pushed the gravestone back into place, wanting nothing more than to take a moment to rest and recover from that dreadful experience underground. But the temple called to her. Dampé was nowhere to be seen, perhaps resting in his shack. So she jogged to the back of the graveyard and climbed up the fenced-off ledge that sectioned off the entrance to the Shadow Temple. She was beginning to feel numb inside, but into darkness she strode again, and not for the last time. Zelda simply stared at the ungodly sight. Her knees shook, and she struggled to stay upright, fighting nausea. There was so much blood. A row of traps lay in front of her, dried blood coating the floor. A massive blade that rose up and slammed down repeatedly. Another one of those fire-wreathed skulls hovering in a gap in the floor. Several gaps she'd need to jump across. And at the end of all of these torturous games, an actual ship floating in the air on wisps of fog. She had doubted herself plenty of times during this journey, but nothing compared to the fear she felt now. A crippling anxiety that made her want to turn tail and escape back to Kageno, to her familiar life of uncertainty and failure. All of that would be better than this. This awful reality. This confrontation of her psyche against the truth. Her royal line had used this temple to torture Sheikah people. How could Impa serve the king so loyally for so long? How did she not break down every time she thought of what Zelda's family had done to her lineage. The images of horror that flashed in her mind. She could only imagine what else Impa knew about it all, what she might have seen. And how was she going to get through all of this? She watched as the blade sliced the air over and over. She determined the pattern, then drew her attention to the floating skull and how often it circled the gap. She took a quick look down below. There was no viewing the bottom. Only a thick darkness stared back up at her. She counted the blade's movements, up and down, and calculated when to make her move. And she ran. First, over the gap, when the floating skull was farthest from her. Then beneath the giant blade, just before it sliced her in half. Then pumping herself up across the largest gap and onto the perplexing, waterless ship. She exclaimed in victory as she landed, then felt the ship began to move. Zelda almost toppled over, but steadied herself. The vessel seemed to be headed towards some known destination, though she couldn't determine where. Not that she had much time to think about it, as something rushed her and knocked her down. Something invisible.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Anger bubbled up inside her at these constant adversaries and never-ending obstacles. She brandished her weapon and the magic eye, whipping it around wildly, and there she spotted it, 3 paces to her left. A Stalfos, a terrifying living skeleton, humongous and flesh-hungry. Once the magic eye registered the enemy, it remained visible to her own eyes. Whatever magic this was most certainly intrigued her. The fight started swift, Zelda quick on her feet, while the Stalfos was too heavy for fast movements. But he was strong. Each time he brought his blade down on hers, the force threatened to vibrate her soul into oblivion. Sparks flew, and they both grunted with their attacks. At one point, the enemy got the best of her, catching her off balance. She fell backward, her scimitar the only barrier between her chest and the long blade. The Stalfos pushed and pushed, while her arms shook with the pressure. Just as she thought she was done for, a platform came into view. An opportunity for her to jump ship. She used every last bit of strength and adrenaline she had to force the Stalfos off of her. He fell back, and she took advantage of those few seconds of freedom to leap onto the platform, and then watched the ship and the Stalfos bob away on thin air. Zelda bent over, her hands on her knees, panting.
What's next?
She shouted at nothing.
What do you have for me? Throw it at me. Go ahead.
Her lungs felt as though they would burst, as angry tears threatened to spill from her eyes. It seems you've had quite enough, a voice said from behind her. Zelda whipped around to see a white-bearded Sheikah man standing tall and proud, his arms crossed, and a smirk playing on his lips. The Sage of Shadow, Kage. I suppose now might not be a great time to ask who you are, and why you're here, and why you're posing as a Sheikah. Wonderful. At least she didn't have to explain as much this time. But when she did explain, his expression turned serious. I am honored to meet you, Princess Zelda. He bowed. And I would be honored to teach you the Nocturne of Shadow. Rauru is a dear friend of mine, and I am loyal to his command. But may I first ask, how does your attendant Impa fare? Zelda smiled for the first time in hours.
She is well, Kage. Thank you. How do you know her?
I met her in Kageno long ago. She and I have in common that we are founders of Sheikah towns.
You founded Kageno?
Kage nodded.
But then you must be very old.
He smirked again. Very old indeed. Zelda bit her lip, wanting to ask the one question that had been on her mind since the well.
Kage, is it true that my family tortured your people here? Why are you the sage when so much has been taken from you in this forsaken temple?
She couldn't understand it. She knew the Sage of Shadow was a Sheikah, but never imagined they'd be subjected to living in such a terrible environment, and a constant reminder of a history that went so dreadfully. Kage raised his hand to his chin, considering. I like to think of my being here as a way for our people to take it back, to reclaim our souls, our culture, our fate. My aim is to transform this place into a temple where our people can come for refuge, for worship, and for community. May seem impossible right now, but I have all the time in the world. She looked to the ground in shame, grateful that he couldn't see her full face. All the time in the world. He brought out what Zelda thought might be a lute, the strings bright gold and shimmering. Let us play. She learned the song, finding it easier to pick out the right string each time she played one of these tunes. It took only minutes this time. The minor notes made for a haunting melody, but the ending left off with a flourish that left her feeling just a bit more hopeful. When they finished, Kage bowed again. If you need anything from me in the future, Princess, do let me know. Zelda swallowed the lump in her throat and gave a nod, despite her knowing that she'd never speak to Kage again.
I'll let Impa know you say hello,
she offered instead. Playing the Nocturne of Shadow and transporting into the graveyard was the most refreshing feeling she'd had since the day dawned. One more temple to go. She decided she should expect the worst. Perhaps then, the impending doom she felt would not cripple her beyond function. Castletown, filled to the brim with scurrying residents, shopkeepers hollering for customers, and music in the air. And Zelda simply basked in it. The contrast from when she was last here was startling. She could see the hazy tip of Hyrule Castle's spires in the distance, and wondered what her younger self might be up to. A little girl skipping across the square caught her attention. She carried a little dog in her arms, and her happiness infected everyone she passed by. Zelda smiled, taken in, but it faded when she saw the building into which the child entered. The bazaar, Garen's bazaar. Though she was here to replenish her food supplies, she could not take her attention off the shop. That child. She casually wandered over to the building, acting as though she was simply browsing the marketplace. She peered into a window in the center of the door, swallowing her nervousness. Inside, she saw him, behind the counter. The little girl set her dog down and ran over to him. He picked her up, swinging her into the air while they both laughed. He held her and spoke to her, pure love evident in his expression. Zelda's heart sank. She wanted to burst through the door and reveal every secret she knew to Garen, that his family was to die, that Hyrule was to burn. Urge him to take them away from here. What could it hurt? If Rauru was correct that fate was in play, that everything that should happen would happen, then why couldn't she warn them? Rifts in time? What did that even mean? Garen deserved to know. He was an innocent in all of this, and so was his family. She had to tell him. She gripped the doorknob, determination guiding her, and turned it. "Pardon me," someone drawled behind her. That voice. Her heart stopped in her chest and she froze. That voice. Zelda turned slowly, her breathing quickening, and raised her eyes to gape at the searing, malevolent face of Ganondorf. The Desert King stared her down. She shook slightly, all of her senses and instincts screaming at her to run, but she stood, rooted to the spot. He raised an eyebrow in annoyance. "Move, Sheikah," he growled, "or I will move you." Finally, her sensibilities kicked in, and she stepped aside, allowing him to enter the bazaar. What was he doing here? She watched him through the window as he approached the counter. Garen put his daughter down gently and greeted Ganondorf as he would any other patron. Whatever they spoke of, it appeared cordial and quick. Ganondorf began to turn back toward the door, and Zelda sprinted toward an alleyway to the east of the square before he could see her. She watched him exit the bazaar, grumbling to himself. He pushed roughly through a throng of people crowding the fruit cart, ignoring their cries of frustration, and turned down the lane that led to the castle. He must be headed to see her father. Zelda narrowed her eyes. Ganondorf had played the long game and spinelessly tricked the king into thinking he was an ally. That, of course, was not true. It was simply his way of infiltrating the royal family and getting everything he wanted. She seared with anger as she watched him disappear around the corner. His treachery was legendary, in her time at least, but no one knew now. No one knew his evil intentions, that he would lead a successful coup of the entire kingdom, that Hyrule's fate rested on his betrayal. But things happened the way they did for a reason. Because now, she was here. Now she was taking steps to save her world and protect further generations from harm and control. Rauru had told her she must not be tempted to change things, but, as Dampé had pointed out, she could fix them. Zelda strolled out from the alleyway, her head held high. It was time to finish this. Time to take back control. Seeing Ganondorf's face was a strong reminder that her mission was not just important, not just necessary. It was destiny. The contrast of the Gerudo region's environment to the rest of Hyrule fascinated Zelda. She'd never been to the fortress, but she'd ridden past the area with her father in a carriage once when he'd been negotiating ally terms with Ganondorf. She had stayed behind in Impa's charge, while the king and his entourage of soldiers made the trek in. She remembered asking Impa what the Gerudo were like. Impa had described them as warriors, and women who took flak from no one, a confident and proud people. A community made up almost entirely of women seemed incredible to Zelda's young mind, but the fact that they all loyally followed one man puzzled her, even at that age. Now, she knew that it was likely because he instilled fear, and they knew that whatever he threatened, he could follow through with. Perhaps they were just frightened into submission, but they were warriors. Couldn't they take him down if they worked together? She was probably missing key information, but whether she understood their way of life or not, she had to infiltrate their spirit temple, find its sage, and hope to the goddesses that she would not simply be murdered on the spot by an angry warrior woman and Ganondorf sympathizer. She had saved this temple for last for a reason. The Gerudo, while posing as allies to Hyrule, were not truly friends. Not with Ganondorf as their king. This Zelda knew, but the Gerudo did not realize that anyone had called their bluff, so this meant she may be able to simply walk through their fortress and into the desert where the spirit temple rested. If they wanted to keep up appearances, they wouldn't risk taking her down. She just needed a good story, and she was fairly certain she had one. It had worked on Kakariko's innkeeper, after all, but this time, it needed an extra layer. Thank the goddesses, Ganondorf was not here right now. Whatever meeting he was having with the king was taking much time, and hopefully he would be staying the night in the castle. Confronting his horrible face again was the last thing she needed. Zelda strode confidently up toward the bridge leading into the region, and as she did so, a Gerudo guard stepped into her path. Zelda was surprised to find that she looked young, probably Zelda's age. They employed teenagers as guards then. These women certainly did not pull any punches, and she wondered how demanding a Gerudo's upbringing might be.
Who are you, and what business do you have with the Gerudo?
She inquired. Her voice was pleasant, but the request was certainly more akin to a demand than a question. Of course, Zelda's last encounter with the Gerudo wasn't so pleasant, and she planned on making this one as peaceful as she could.
I am Sheik, at your service.
She bowed, low and respectful. The guard gave her the once-over, raising an eyebrow.
I am a researcher of geography, and I have come to study your desert and its surrounding environments. I work for the royal family, and the king has sent me with Lord Ganondorf's approval. I have just left their negotiation meeting.
Zelda handed the skeptical girl a parchment, with terms of research and science exploration written in perfect script. She had forged her own father's signature at the bottom and carefully painted the royal family's crest at the top. She smiled under her face wraps, remembering the days when Impa would teach her to read and write with old copies of similar contracts the king had written up. She had matched his signature so many times, it came natural to her now. Even after all these years, her pen flowed over the parchment without hesitation. The young guard scanned the false contract, squinting her eyes. It was unlikely she'd ever even seen the king's signature, so this should go off without a hitch. But she took her time and read through it all, before glancing back at Zelda, shrugging her shoulders, and handing it back over.
You may pass.
She relented, stepping aside. Zelda moved past her, but the guard grabbed her arm. She leaned forward, her musky perfume filling Zelda's nostrils.
But come say hello to me on your way out.
She said with a sultry, flirty gaze, smirking.
As you wish,
the princess replied, and the guard released her. The Gerudo were a forward people. Zelda made a mental note to teleport out of the desert instead of making the trek back here. Not one warrior woman stopped her as she navigated through the fortress grounds. She supposed that once someone was let through by the guard, they were trusted by all. That made things easier. The gate leading to the desert was open, and Zelda could see a sandstorm brewing just beyond. She tightened her face wraps, readying herself for the ensuing march through the sand. How did she end up back here? For the third time, Zelda trudged through the sands at a deliberate pace and, as far as she was aware, straight west, but came upon the entrance to the desert as though she hadn't made any progress at all. There was something amiss. She brought out Rovin's father's compass for the first time on her journey. Though it pained her to see it, she needed help. Using it to navigate through the stinging winds westward, she felt sure that she wasn't veering off course. And yet, again she came upon the entrance. There must be some sort of magical barrier preventing her from getting close to the temple, and it figured they couldn't all be easy to find. She stood with her hands on her hips, frowning. She was missing something, some hint of how to traverse this place. It was like an invisible wall was guiding her backward. An invisible wall. Zelda pulled out the magic eye. Absently, she wondered if it was really given such a simple name, suspecting that Dampe had coined it himself. Perhaps she needed its power to see the true path. Raising it to her eyes, she gasped. There, suddenly perched a line of tall wooden stumps with red flags at the tops that waved wildly in the sandy winds. Markers. She wasted no time, following them, ensuring not to veer too far from the pathway they indicated. Within a few minutes, the sandstorm cleared, and she was confronted with the most colossal statue she had ever seen. It nestled in a mountainside, an enormous goddess, or perhaps empress, the visage reminiscent of the woman warriors themselves. She sat tall, her legs crossed and her hands resting serenely upon them. Zelda stood spellbound at the glory of this effigy to womanhood. That's what it felt like, a reminder of feminine power. She felt invigorated just gazing upon it. She stepped up the stairs to a wide entrance, her confidence soaring. Maybe this temple wouldn't be so bad. Maybe she would fly through it. Wouldn't that be nice? The entrance room offered Zelda two directions, a small hole in the wall through which she could squeeze herself, and a locked door to the right. The only passable way seemed to be the tunnel, so she dropped to her hands and knees and maneuvered in and out the other side. If she had been just a little older, she wasn't sure she'd have fit. Small mercies. Once through, her heart jumped a bit at the challenge that lay before her. A narrow, raised pathway, high enough that she couldn't see the bottom, and a gap to jump in the center. Then, a door on the other side, through which she hoped she wouldn't encounter some sort of adversary. The princess had had quite enough of those, though she did feel a bit of pride at how much she had accomplished up to now. Garen would be proud as well, and she couldn't wait to tell him all about it. Impa too. Her attendant would perhaps have a different attitude toward her if she knew everything Zelda had been through. She examined the gap, inching across the pathway carefully. Nothing but darkness lurked down below, and her legs quivered. But she had jumped plenty of gaps in the floor by now. She could do this. Taking a running start, she went to jump across. But just before she could, a strange, serpent-like creature crept up from that darkness. Her startled leap did not reach as high as she would have liked, and as she flew through the air, time seemed to slow, and she knew her feet would not make it to solid ground. She grunted as she grasped at the edge of the pathway on the other side, slipping a little, but clinging on. Her hands trembled, her weight pulling her downward. She hung from the edge, kicking to try and heft herself up, but she couldn't find any footholds. The wall of the pathway was smooth stone, man-made and unclimbable. This couldn't be happening. Not now. She was slipping, her hands not strong enough to hold her body weight. They were giving up. Something bumped her side. She looked to see that eerie serpent-like monster tapping her with its head. Gently. She recoiled, but it wasn't trying to hurt her. She took a chance and grabbed at it with her left arm, encircling its body and holding on. It simply bobbed up and down and didn't seem to be weighed down too much. She freed her other hand from the edge and hugged the creature. Its texture wasn't exactly pleasant. It felt squishy and scaly, but it allowed her to cling to it, and it floated up, maneuvering her up onto the pathway. It set her down, she let go, and it lowered itself back down into the depths of the room, disappearing entirely. What in Hyrule was that? She did not see nor heard of anything like it before, and it wasn't evil. It wanted to help. Zelda decided not to dwell too long on the conundrum. She should be grateful. Moving through the door, she gaped at the scene. Another massive statue. Again, a woman. This time her arms raised, palms up. A series of mirrors littered the floor of the room, all facing different directions. A skylight at the top of the space shone a bright ray of light all the way to the bottom. Mirrors and light. She studied the mirrors, noting that they were sort of shaped like that odd creature that had saved her life. They were set up in such a way that if they were turned toward each other, they'd reflect back and forth. She stepped toward the mirror closest to the ray of light, working off of a silly hunch. But it couldn't hurt to try, right? She pushed it toward the light, surprised that it wasn't all that heavy. The stone seemed to be made of some kind of porous mineral, maybe sandstone. As the mirror reached the light, it shone another ray outward, reflecting it. Yes, this must be the way. She got to work, spinning each mirror around until its ray was connected to the next, creating a network of light. The last mirror stumped her. She wasn't sure where it was supposed to point, but then she spotted a stylistic sun carved into the bottom of the statue, complete with a smile and closed eyes. She spun the mirror and the light fell onto the sun, turning it bright yellow. The eyes opened and the sun rays around it rotated. She heard some sort of unseen mechanism clicking, and a door appeared on the wall opposite her out of nowhere. She triumphantly stepped through it, taking one last look at the series of light rays that lit up the room in a dazzling way. A raised round platform sat in the center of the next room, where a Garuda woman perched in the same position as the enormous statue outside. The Sage of Spirit, Suna. Zelda quietly stepped toward the platform. She didn't want to disturb the sage's meditation, but of course, as these things tended to go.
I've been expecting you,
Suna said, her eyes still closed, her body rigid.
You staged quite the con on my bridge guard. Researcher indeed.
Great. This sage seemed to have the sight as well.
I apologize, Suna, but I had to get to you.
Suna finally opened her eyes and stood, one hand on her hip. Her beauty was startling, like the rays of light.
I understand. I'm rather impressed, Princess. Now, I knew you were coming, but I don't know why. Enlighten me.
Perhaps the sight was limited for some. Zelda explained her plight, reiterating her journey. Suna listened with rapt attention.
And now, I must learn the Requiem of Spirit from you. It is the last song I need, the last step I must take.
Suna stepped down from the platform.
Tell me, these terrible things that are happening to Hyrule in your time, are they caused by our Lord Ganondorf? Yes. How did you know? I didn't. I suspected. He has been plotting against Hyrule for many years now. It only makes sense.
Zelda panicked inside. She wasn't supposed to be giving this information out, especially to the sages.
Don't worry, Princess. I understand the sands of time better than you'd think. How they work, how delicate they are. If Lord Ganondorf is meant to do this, it will happen whether I try to stop it or not.
Suna took Zelda's hand.
Same goes for you. If you are meant to stop him, you will. Thank you, Suna.
She smiled gratefully. Hearing that from a sage herself, she couldn't have asked for a better source of comfort.
Now, I will teach you the Requiem of Spirit, and you will promise me that when you have accomplished your mission, however many years from now, you will come to visit again, yes?
She was so tired of lying. Lying to these wise and gracious souls who had only helped her thus far. But Raru's warnings rang in her mind. She simply nodded in response and allowed Suna to teach her the song on what looked like a pungi, an instrument Zelda had heard about from Impa's lectures about the Gerudo. The sadness in the song seeped into her bones. It sang of reverence for those who had fought and died for noble causes. It sang for the sages. Zelda closed her eyes as the last note rang out, and let one tear fall. It was all she would allow.
Princess.
Suna's voice interrupted Zelda's sadness, full of concern.
What is that?
Zelda opened her eyes to see a bright, golden light emitting from her right hand, a halo surrounding it. She gazed at it with trepidation as it grew brighter and focused into a triangular shape. The Triforce. 3 triangles made up the symbol, and the bottom left shape shone brighter than the others, with a grainy light shimmering. Zelda felt her light magic respond, as though the two magics were communicating.
What is happening?
She shouted.
Oh, Princess, you've been blessed by the goddesses. What do you mean? Why is only one pot shining? Do you know much of the Triforce and its power? Only that it may be wished upon by someone with a balanced heart.
Suna nodded.
Yes, and if one with an imbalanced heart wishes upon it, the Triforce will break apart. It will send each piece to the person who most reflects the magic imbued within them. Power, wisdom, and courage. And you, my dear, you possess the Triforce of wisdom. What? That cannot be. Why would it come to me? Do you not see? You have completed the first part of your mission. You have proven your worthiness, Princess.
She supposed that was true, but it was difficult to imagine even so. Still, after everything, knowing that she had done what she set out to, she felt like an imposter. A realization hit her. An imbalanced heart wished on the Triforce.
Ganondorf. He touched the Triforce. He must have, and it split apart. Where have the other pieces gone?
Suna shook her head.
There is no way of knowing. Not until you approach the pieces, both of them. They will call to each other when they are close.
She may never know then, but this also meant that Ganondorf did not successfully wish on the Triforce. He was able to take over Hyrule, but not because of the Triforce's powerful magic, which meant
he'll be looking for them. All of them.
Suna raised a hand to her shoulder in comfort.
Your mission is not over, Princess. Time demands your attention. You must go back now.
The sage spoke true. It was time. Hyrule was waiting. Zelda climbed back out of the hole beneath the gravestone and slid it into place again. She'd decided to bring the magic eye back to the well before she left, to place it in the chest. She wanted to honor the people of Kakariko and their wish for the artifact to remain hidden beneath their town. Thankfully, the windmill operator hadn't yet filled the well back up with water, so it was an easy trek into the hole and back out. No amorphous monster tried to follow her out this time. For once, she felt as though fate had given her a break, but now as she strummed her harp to be whisked away back to Lake Hylia, her heart ached. Ryuta, Raku, Mori, Kage, and Suna, the sages who tender-heartedly helped her achieve her goal. They also did it for Hyrule, proving their loyalty and honor, and she couldn't help but regret how much she couldn't tell them. And she was grieving them already. Though they would not pass for a time, at least they would have that time to accomplish their own missions, to protect the temples which they called home. As she traipsed across the edge of the lake toward the spot where she'd first arrived in this time, she couldn't help but wonder what it meant that she was a sage as well. She had no temple to protect, but she did have the Triforce of Wisdom. Still unsure of what that really meant, her soul was riddled with worry. She hoped that when she returned, Rauru would call to her in a vision again, and she could ask him every question she'd thought of since this all began. There it was, the tree where Kami was tied 4 years from now. Zelda took one last look at Lake Hylia, at the clear blue sky, the rolling green plains, and the silhouette of the castle miles away. Her home. She never thought she would have to leave it behind again. She played the Ballad of the Goddess and kept her eyes open to watch her beloved Hyrule disappear. Zelda smelled smoke. Only half a mile from Kageno, Kami trotted, carrying Zelda back to the Sheikah town. Being back in this time was a little disorienting, as though her brain had to keep reminding herself of when she was. But the confusion was fading. Now, as the looming mountains grew larger, Zelda saw plumes of smoke rising from the town, and she heard screaming.
No.
She whispered and spurred Kami into a gallop. Within minutes, she arrived at the gate, where a guard stood injured. Blood poured from a wound in his shoulder. "Sheik!" he shouted with relief.
What happened here?
She asked, ripping some fabric from Kami's saddle blanket and wrapping it around the wound. "It was the Gerudo. They attacked again. They've left now, but they took someone with them."
Who?
"I do not know. Whoever it was, their head was covered. Please, help the residents. I can't leave my post." She nodded and left Kami with the soldier, bolting through the gate and toward the center of town. Homes were burning, and people rushed about, helping the wounded. She sprinted as fast as she could toward the inn. She had to find Impa. She needed to know that she was all right, but on her way, she gasped and stalled. Garen's armor shop was in flames.
Karen!
She screamed, forgetting her Sheik voice in terror and sprinting toward the burning building. A few residents chucked buckets of water at it, trying to put out the fire, but it was doing no good. "Zelda!" a familiar voice called out.
Roven?
She searched wildly around her and saw him crouching near another untouched building. She ran over to him, and he stood to embrace her. He held her so tightly, she felt as though she would burst.
Where?
Her gaze fell to the ground, where Garen leaned up against the wall, clutching his stomach. She pushed Roven from her and rushed to Garen's side, inspecting his wound. She despaired at the gore of it. It was a gaping hole. There was no way it could be mended. Her eyes welled up and her mouth hung open. She wasn't able to do anything to help him. Nothing at all. Garen looked up at her and smiled weakly. "Hey, princess," he said and groaned in pain. "How was your trip?"
Garen. No.
"Don't," he interrupted. "You need to stay strong. Impa. They've taken her."
What?
Zelda turned to Roven, who looked shamefully to the ground.
Where?
"We can only assume back to their fortress," Roven said. Garen tried to stop them. He tried to save her. His voice shook, and a tear fell down his cheek. Her mind raced.
Telma?
"Back at the inn. She's all right." She turned her attention back to Garen, who seemed to be nodding off.
Garen, stay with me.
She would figure this out. She would save him. She just had to. He grasped her hand, leaving it bloody. "Don't worry, princess. You don't have to return the favor by stitching my wound. Besides, it's time for you to take some more steps, yeah? I think I've run out of mine."
No, you're going to take more. You must. For me, for our home, remember?
He chuckled lightly. "Home. Did you see me? In the past, did you see me?" She clutched his hand tighter and smiled through her tears.
Yes, I did see you. And I saw your daughter. You were holding her and you were happy.
His smile widened. "I remember that happiness. I remember feeling that." He looked her in the eyes and grew serious. "You gave me that feeling again, Zelda. You gave me happiness. I won't forget that, no matter where I end up."
You did too, Garen. You gave me that too,
she said. But he didn't hear her. The light in his eyes faded. His expression deadened, and his grip faltered.
Don't go, Garen. Don't leave. Please. Please.
She sobbed into his hand as Roven knelt next to her and held her close to him. "Wait," he said suddenly. "You can save him." She shook her head, but Roven ignored her. "Use your harp. You can still save him. You can save everyone. Go back in time. You can change it! His desperation saturated the air around them, but she knew she could not do as he asked. She gazed at him with a devastated expression.
No, Reuben, I can't. No one can change it.
She kissed Garen's bloody hand and set it down gently.
It is destiny. Princess?
Zelda gasped as Telma walked up to the group. She rose and hugged the woman tightly.
Are you all right?
She asked. Telma nodded, but she glanced at Garen and shut her eyes.
They left something for you,
she said.
Pinned to the inn's door with a knife.
She handed Zelda a parchment, messy Hylian script scratched across it. Zelda read it, and her expression turned sour. What is it? What did they say? Rovin asked. Zelda balled the parchment in her fist and shook with fury.
If Impa is to be released, I am to give myself up to him. I am to surrender to Ganondorf.
Chapter 9. Chosen by Destiny.
I just don't understand how they knew.
Telma vigorously wiped down the dining room tables, a nervous habit she tended to use to cope.
I thought they had given up searching for you after their last attack.
Zelda sat in a chair, watching Telma bustle around the room. The woman was not one to sit still for very long.
I'm not sure either, but it doesn't matter. They know.
The Sheikah elder, Vernia, had begun an investigation into it all. She was devastated about Impa's kidnapping and was not going to stand back and do nothing. She'd already told Zelda that she had a lead, but would not reveal it yet, claiming she wanted to be absolutely certain. Telma paused and took a long look at the princess.
We should send a few guards with you. No, the fewer souls the better. But dear,
she struggled to keep back tears.
You've already been through so much. You've just returned.
Zelda stood and embraced her.
I love you too, Telma. But I must go. Don't worry.
She released her and squeezed her arms.
Rovin will be with me.
He had quite literally begged to come along. Rescuing Impa was a challenge for which she was not fully prepared, and was the only reason she'd agreed. Telma had insisted that they take the night to rest up, and in an hour's time, they would be on their way. Not that Zelda had gotten any sleep. So much had been lost. She felt that everything she'd done up until now was for nothing if Impa did not survive this. Her heart felt empty, and she knew Rovin could see it. She could tell he was worried for her, so she'd been putting on a brave face for both him and Telma. They were undeniably good friends, looking out for her, encouraging her to talk about Garen's death, but it felt so much harder without Impa here. So she squared her shoulders and cleared her mind of distractions, just as Impa would have instructed her to do. She focused on planning this rescue mission instead of wallowing in feelings she did not want to face. Whether this was a healthy tactic, well, that was another story.
Where is that boy? He's taking his time, isn't he?
Telma complained. As though on cue, Rovin stumbled into the inn's dining area, hauling too many supplies for the trip ahead. Weapons and loaves of bread spilling onto the floor. Zelda sighed.
Rovin, we can't bring all this,
she said, helping him clean up. Oh. He avoided her eyes, something he'd been doing since she returned. They hadn't spoken about their last encounter before she'd left, and she hoped they wouldn't. She didn't know what she would say anyway. Sorry I used you for my own comfort and sadness? How could she admit that out loud? Telma rushed over to help.
Let me organize your pack, Rovin. You and Zelda go sit and rest.
It was not a request. They obliged, and Rovin anxiously drummed his fingers on the table and bounced a knee, while Zelda sat perfectly still, watching him.
We're going to find her,
she assured him.
I won't return without Impa.
He gave her a weak smile. but his nervousness was overtaking him, she could tell. Zelda thought for a moment and then took out the compass, placing it gently on the table between them. Rovan stilled and stared at it, then finally looked her in the eyes, his own welling up slightly.
"Thank you for trusting me with it,"
she said.
"Though the only time I had to use it was in a desert that kept magically whisking me back to the entrance."
She smirked at him, hoping the humor would make him feel better. That's how he always approached her lack of confidence. So perhaps she could give back. He let out a soft laugh. "That's the only thing you've told me about your journey." It was true. She hadn't really let anyone in on what she'd gone through. There wasn't much time, for one thing. And for another, she wasn't really sure how to talk about it.
"I'll fill you in more on our way to Gerudo Valley,"
she promised.
"but be warned, there's a lot to tell."
"I can't wait," he replied, his eyes bright with mischief like she was used to. When Telma finished, she insisted they each eat a filling lunch before departing, and hugged them both too tightly, sending them on their way with worried eyes. At the stable, Rovan noted Milana's absence. In fact, Zelda hadn't seen her at all since she returned. She couldn't say she wasn't relieved at that. They left Kageno on Kami's back, Rovan straddled behind Zelda and clutching her for dear life. He wasn't used to riding, which meant they'd have to make more stops than she would like. But they were finally on their way, and her determination deepened. They would rescue Impa. They would bring her home. And if she had to, Zelda would give up everything she had worked toward to do it. The normally 2-day trek took 3 instead. Rovan's exhaustion caught up to him, and he almost fell off the horse at a high speed. So they stopped for the night. They sat near a fire, warming their hands. The weather was beginning to turn, the nights becoming colder, and while it was a bit of an inconvenience to have to look after someone else, Zelda was glad she wasn't alone this time. "It must be hard to be back out here so soon," Rovan said, breaking the awkward silence. She responded with a wry smile. He had no idea. "Did you meet anyone interesting?"
"Yes."
she replied, smiling at the memories.
"There was a potion maker who could see right through my disguise, a gravekeeper who gave me life advice, a silly fairy who guided me through the forest, and of course, the sages. Each of them powerful. Each of them full of promise."
Rovan frowned. "And they were all murdered," he said. "Zelda, I'm sorry. That must have been impossible." It felt good to be seen like that, her sorrows recognized as valid. She'd had to wrestle with the feelings all on her own, pushing through the pain to get to where she needed to be, for Hyrule's sake, for their future, but it didn't make it any less terrible. And Rovan seeing that so clearly made her feel safer, understood, loved. He deserved answers. She glanced at him and cleared her throat.
"Rovan, I need to explain myself to you. What I did, why I did it. It can't really be justified, but perhaps if you would allow me—"
"Nothing you could do would make me hate you," he interrupted. "I don't need any explanation. I can see right through you, remember? I know what you were thinking. I know that you needed something in that moment. To help you. To keep you sane. And honestly, I did too." She blinked, taken aback.
"You're not upset with me?"
He smiled, his eyes kind and full of friendship. "Zelda, you're a person, not just a princess. Not just a warrior or a Sheikah in disguise. A person. I've told you for years, you never get to take a breath. And if I could allow a quiet opportunity for you to finally do that, I would. I will. He reached out a hand to her, and she grasped it without hesitation. "I'm here for you." Whatever that means. She didn't know what to say, so she simply held his hand for a while, and they stared into the fire together. She didn't deserve this treatment. Roven, like Rauru, viewed her as some kind of pure soul, but she was selfish. Dark Sheik had literally mirrored the evil in her heart, according to Ryuta. So many could have survived this war of death and destruction if she had simply found a way to stop Ganondorf's plans before they even began. From the very beginning, she had made mistakes, and she had brought all of these people into her circle of doom. Those old familiar feelings of hopelessness crept in again, but she forced them away. She had to focus. At least, she still had friends. They lay down to get a few hours of sleep, but her mind would not shut off. Why did she resist it so much? The potential of a relationship, of being with someone who felt unconditionally for her, it had always felt like too much, too soon, too sensical. And though Zelda thrived on things making sense, this was the one aspect of her life that she could not rationalize. Part of it was her guilt, but was it also Link? She'd fallen for him as a child, wholeheartedly. She'd admitted that to herself long before now. But this was years ago. She'd been so young, and so many things had changed, not just in the world, but in her. Link would awaken with the mind of a child. Years of missing out on a full life that would have matured and taught him. The two of them would exist on opposite ends of a spectrum, and she doubted they could relate to each other anymore. Yet he still remained with her, in her very soul. Even though Roven had actually been there, even though he had grown up with her, it was a paradox that she could not puzzle through. And as sleep took her, finally, the two heroes fought for space in her heart. It had been a while since she'd seen the sacred realm, but it looked exactly the same, as did Rauru, his owl-like eyes regarding her once again. "You did well, princess," he said, his usual serene smile gracing his face.
But Impa...
Impa is meant for a higher destiny. What did that mean? You must be the one to tell her that she is to be called. Wait, Impa was to become a sage? The ancient sages you met were destined to fall, and when the hero of time vanquishes the evil curses plaguing the temples, new sages must be called to their own destinies. Impa, indeed, is one of those sages. Zelda's heart ached. The sages had been viciously torn from their lives and their specialness. If it was so easy for Ganondorf to do, who was to say he couldn't do it again? Impa would be in danger as a sage, at risk. As shall all of them be, but without sages to protect the elemental magics that run through the veins of Hyrule, the lands will fall into a permanent darkness. No magic will remain, no connection. Every soul shall perish. Impa is part of a destiny that protects the land you call home. And you must tell her of this destiny, so that she may prepare. Zelda shook her head.
You mean, so that she can abandon us? So that she must sacrifice any future for herself that includes a family?
She thought of Vernia, their potential as a couple, their love. A sage's power lies in their ability to protect the people's right to a family. Sacrifice is a powerful force, one that a sage earns. They are champions, princess. Your hero of time has already made sacrifices in order to save Hyrule, as have you. as will you. She was a sage too, the seventh, guarding the Triforce of Wisdom, and Impa, she knew, would take the reins of destiny and gallop full throttle into the fire and shadows. Their paths were clear, and Zelda begrudgingly knew it was time to accept them. They waited until nightfall to sneak into the fortress. There were fewer Gerudo guards patrolling, and a better chance for them to make it to the prison cell that they'd spotted from the ground. Zelda had been surprised to note that the bridge into the valley had been broken. Only a gap remained, one large enough that they could not leap it on their own, but had to push Kami to her limit to jump across. They tied her off behind a boulder and had snuck to the entrance, getting the lay of the land. A guard paced close to them, and a torch lit the area. They'd have to figure out how to get around her, but Zelda could not see how. "We need to incapacitate her somehow," Rovan whispered. Zelda's mind immediately flashed to her test with Garen, when she'd gotten the best of his senses and surprised him. He'd been so proud of her, she could do it again.
"Stay here,"
she said. Rovan grasped her hand to keep her back, but she pulled it away, shaking her head and putting a finger to her lips. She mouthed the words, "Trust me," drew her scimitar, and silently and quickly moved toward the guard, who marched away from them. From behind the warrior woman, Zelda acted first, grabbing her, the scimitar to her throat, and pulling her into the darkness.
"Not a sound,"
she whispered harshly into the woman's ear, who smartly obeyed, dropping her own weapons when Zelda demanded it. Zelda whirled the guard around and pushed her up against a sandy wall, her weapon still pressed against her throat. The guard eyed them both, her gaze searing. Gerudo women were not used to being overpowered. Rovan rushed to retrieve the discarded weapons.
"We need you to get us to the prison cell,"
Zelda told her.
"Guide us there without alerting the guards, and I will let you live."
She hadn't taken a life, not yet, but in her heart, she knew she spoke the truth. She would eliminate this woman if she had to.
"That will be difficult,"
the guard replied.
"But not impossible,"
Zelda retorted.
"If you're here on behalf of the princess, tell her to come on over and show her pretty face. If she does so, we'll release her oh-so-valued Sheikah guardian."
Zelda pushed harder against the guard's throat, causing her to grunt.
"I am warning you now. Nothing will keep us from Impa. Not you. Not your misguided people. And certainly not your ultimatums. Take us to the prison, or I will cut your throat and let you bleed out in the sand. No one will find you until dawn, and by then, the flies will already be swarming."
The guard's nostrils flared. Zelda was getting to her.
"All right.
She submitted.
We'll need to hug the east wall and climb the fortress."
"Move."
Zelda pushed her in front of them, and she stumbled, full of fury. But she did as she was told, sticking to the wall and watchful of the other guards. They reached the fortress, and Zelda climbed first, then the guard, and then Rovan, keeping the Gerudo between them. She navigated over the fortress roof, leading them closer to the prison cell. As they did so, Zelda could hear a loud voice booming from it, a voice that raised the hair on her arms. She grabbed the guard's tunic and yanked her backward, throwing her to the ground, and pointed her weapon at her.
"How long has Ganondorf been here?"
She never expected him to come back to Gerudo Fortress, seeing as he'd taken over the castle and proclaimed himself King of Hyrule. She thought perhaps he'd let his Gerudo loyalists do his dirty work for him, but it seemed she'd been wrong. Rovan's jaw dropped. "He's here? Him?" Zelda had told him the stories of the King of Evil, each and every horrible thing he'd done. Rovan only had these tales to go off of, but now he would see exactly what Ganondorf was. It brought her no pleasure, but here they were. Someone else she cared for must confront the villain that was Ganondorf.
How long?
The guard smirked.
Long enough to leave poor Impa in shambles.
Zelda's heart dropped. It was a scenario she'd been trying to deny, but her fear was now realized. Ganondorf was torturing her. Zelda lost her focus for 1 second, but that was all it took. The guard bolted, leaping off the fortress roof and sprinting away. Rovan tried to run after her, but Zelda stopped him.
No, we need to get to Impa now.
He looked panicked but nodded, and they rushed forward toward the prison cell, where a whip could be heard lashing. Zelda winced as though she could feel it herself, but she heard no cries from Impa. A barred window, where Zelda and Rovan quietly watched, provided a view inside the cell as Ganondorf paced back and forth before Impa, whose arms were chained to the wall, outstretched in a most uncomfortable way. Bloody gashes covered them, and Zelda had to stop herself from whimpering.
All of this can stop, Sheikah. Just tell me where she's gone. Your stamina is inspiring, truly. But there is a time when all must give in.
He leaned close to Impa's face. Sweat dripped down her temples, and she panted heavily, but said nothing. She looked him dead in his eyes, defiance radiating from her. He chuckled slowly.
You and your people. You deign to reclaim a place that hates you. Your king is no more. He cannot protect you from those who would wish you dead. Kage knew it.
He lifted a lock of hair from Impa's face, tucking it behind her ear, almost lovingly. She remained still.
When I sliced his chest open, he knew it. He hid in that temple for years, pretending to love Hyrule. After everything that royal family did to your kind, you still wish to guard its princess?
Zelda shook with fury. Kage. Impa finally opened her lips as if to say something, but instead, she spat into Ganondorf's eyes. He recoiled and smacked her across her face. Zelda moved to get up, but Rovan stilled her. Wiping his forehead, Ganondorf's lip curled, and a dangerous anger emanated from him.
If you refuse to give me what I seek, then I suppose I shall have to open your chest as well.
He stood, drawing a long blade from a sheath on his hip. Zelda tried to shout, a small noise escaping her, but Rovan covered her mouth with his hand and pulled her down below the barred window.
One last chance,
he told Impa, who remained defiantly silent. Zelda and Rovan slowly eased back up to look through the window again, and watched helplessly as Ganondorf raised his sword. The door to the prison cell burst open. An enchantingly beautiful Gerudo woman stood there, one that reminded Zelda of Suna, but she wasn't Suna at all.
Lord Ganondorf, why don't you allow me to take over the interrogation?
He snarled at her. You think you could do any better?
Sire, she's our only lead. Let me try. Besides, you're needed back at the castle. Kakariko residents are making waves again, begging for assistance. Their economy is still suffering.
The evil man scoffed.
I couldn't care less about their economy. They should help themselves.
Well, they won't unless you tell them to, sire. For now, they're beating down the castle doors. Your fierceness will keep them in check.
Ganondorf sighed in annoyance.
So be it. If you happen to squeeze any information from this Sheikah, send word immediately.
Of course, sire.
He turned to leave, but stopped.
And Nabooru, if you allow her to escape, do not expect any mercy.
Nabooru nodded once in assent, and Ganondorf left the room, slamming the door behind him. Zelda and Rovan watched him descend a staircase out of sight and mount a huge black steed, galloping off with 2 other Gerudo warriors at his side. Who was this Nabooru? She came at just the right moment and sent Ganondorf away, and shouldn't someone have come to arrest them by now? The guard had escaped minutes ago.
You may come in now,
Nabooru said. Zelda and Rovan exchanged glances. Was she speaking to them? She wasn't looking toward the window.
Don't worry, no one is after you.
She glanced at them, an eyebrow raised.
Come on now. The door is to your right, around the corner.
Hesitantly, they did as she said, entering the room where Impa's weak form sagged against the wall. She had fallen unconscious. Zelda rushed over to her, attempting to wake her, but she was out. She gazed up at Nabooru, who simply stood watching, and drew her weapon.
Who are you? And why did you send him away? Are you going to lock us in here? Because I will fight you with everything I have.
You don't need to speak to me through your Sheikah mask, Princess. I already know who you are.
Of course she did. Rovan knelt next to Impa and began to pull at her chains. Are you on our side? He asked. Nabooru was silent at first. Then she reached into a pocket and pulled out a key, handing it to Rovan.
I am on Hyrule's side,
she said. He took it and unlocked Impa's chains. She slumped onto the ground, but he gently broke her fall. Zelda stood, pulling her face wraps down.
How is it you know who I am?
Nabooru smiled.
My good friend Suna. She told me all about you, your visit, and your mission.
Zelda's mouth fell open slightly.
I've been building a resistance against Ganondorf.
He thinks you're still loyal to him? Rovan asked, arranging Impa's limbs in a more comfortable manner.
He thinks I want power as much as he does. I am betrothed to him, after all.
Betrothed? To Ganondorf? Zelda couldn't help her disgusted expression. Nabooru simply laughed.
Don't worry. I don't plan on actually wedding him.
She took on a more serious tone.
I plan on killing him. Then your mission is much like mine,
Zelda replied. She strode closer to the Gerudo.
What can you tell me? Nothing. For now, I'll help you get Impa out of here.
What will happen to you? Rovan asked. He said he'd show no mercy. Nabooru smiled slyly.
I know how to manipulate him. I'll be fine.
She reached into another pocket and brought out a bottle of red liquid. Zelda recognized it as a healing potion. She wondered where she'd gotten it from, thinking of Granny.
Give this to her. It will wake her and you will be escorted out with no threat to you. Go home and do not return. Not yet. Steps need to be taken for my plan to coalesce, and I can't have anyone disrupting it. How long do you need? Zelda
asked, handing the bottle to Rovan, who gently coaxed Impa to drink it.
As long as possible.
Impa began to stir and embraced Zelda when she saw her.
What is going on? We'll explain everything on the way home,
Zelda replied, palming Impa's cheek, much like Impa would do.
You're safe now.
Nabooru managed to get all 3 of them safely back to Kami in the valley, and even gave them one more horse to take with them. She stopped Zelda before she mounted, an intensity in her eyes.
That man murdered my friend. Suna was special. Not just because she was a sage, but because she was a good person. I will never forgive him, and I know you won't either. We will destroy him, Princess. That I can promise you. But we must be patient. Please do not return for as long as you can. I promise. And should we expect any more raids from your people?
She had to ask, however awkward it might feel.
You will be safe. No one sends a raid unless Ganondorf or I condone it, and I will keep his mind distracted from such acts.
Zelda didn't want to know how Nabooru would be doing that, but her demeanor, her confidence and decency. It all reminded her so much of Suna. A hint of trust was forming.
Thank you, Noboru. And good luck.
They leapt the horses over the broken bridge and galloped away towards safety. The more Zelda searched, the more she found she wasn't truly alone in her fight. There were people she could count on, and she hoped that would never change. Impa's homecoming felt magical. Countless souls hugged and welcomed her back, including Telma, of course, who crushed them all in a group embrace. But Zelda couldn't feel the full effect of it. Not after what Rauru had told her. She didn't know when Impa would be called to the Shadow Temple, but she would be. And Zelda still had to break the news. Knowing how was the trick. Vernia rushed up to Impa and kissed her unabashedly while the people laughed and looked on. This was unbearable. How was she to confess to Impa that everything she was so happy to return to would be taken from her? But before she could contemplate it more, Vernia turned to Zelda, her face set in a grave expression.
Sheik, I know how the Gerudo knew to come here.
She hesitated, nervously glancing from Zelda to Impa and to Rovan.
Vernia, tell us.
Impa said. She swallowed.
It was the stable girl. It was Milana.
Zelda gazed at Milana's defiant face. She sat on a bench in the town's only jail cell. Ironic that Zelda had maneuvered from one cell to another in a matter of days. But this cell was almost never used. Kageno was peaceful. Most of the time. She sat across from the stable girl and sighed. Then she pulled down her face wraps. Vernia had explained to Zelda her hunch that someone from the stables had something to do with the Gerudo's sudden attack. When the warriors arrived, they seemed to actively avoid the stables. She grew suspicious and looked into Milana's activities. She found a letter written in Gerudo script, which she had to translate. In it, the details were mapped out. Milana had somehow found out who Zelda really was. She had realized she was Hyrule's missing princess, one whom the Gerudo had been searching for all these years. Her envy of Sheik took a new form, and she wrote to treacherous warriors explaining that Zelda had been hiding out here. The Gerudo wrote back, naming terms, and pledged that in return for her information, Milana's horses would not be harmed. When they attacked, Milana remained out of sight and protected, while Kageno and its people were ravaged by vicious killers. Of course, Milana had no idea that Zelda would be leaving, and she panicked, trying to contact the Gerudo before they arrived. But it was too late. They came, and Impa was taken. A result Milana did not predict. This meant that Vernia now knew who Zelda was as well. Though Impa loved Vernia, she'd never revealed it to her. But the Sheikah elder was loyal, and hadn't said a word to anyone else about Zelda's identity, or the reason for Milana's betrayal. The only thing Zelda did not know was how. How had Milana discovered her secret? And she was here now to find out.
Here I am,
she said in her true voice. It felt odd, as Milana was someone Zelda would never have willingly revealed herself to. Not in a million years.
Now you have confirmation. I am indeed Princess Zelda of Hyrule. So tell me, Milana, did you hate me so much that my death would have made you satisfied?
The girl glared at her.
I didn't know if they would kill you,
she said rudely.
I just thought they might take you away. That evil king or whatever, I thought he might just throw you in a cell.
And yet it is you who has been thrown into a cell.
Milana clenched her jaw in anger.
Tell me how,
Zelda demanded.
How did you figure it out?
The girl huffed a sardonic laugh.
That kiss.
She said. Zelda's brows knitted together. She saw.
I was there, hiding behind some trees. I was watching you and Roven sparring, hoping he'd get a good punch in. Then he started calling you Zelda and took your face wraps down.
She actually gazed at Zelda in a kind of awe.
Felt stupid. Stupid for missing the signs all these years. I love Roven, and you've been keeping him on your hip all yourself. And I find out you ain't even you?
She spat at Zelda's feet.
It ain't fair. I wanted you gone.
Zelda shook her head sadly. She actually felt pity for Milana. Her jealousy had taken her down a dark path, one that had devastating consequences.
Impa was tortured by that evil king or whatever, because of your choices, because of your envy.
I didn't mean for that.
Oh yes, you did. You meant for terrible things to happen, and you got your wish.
She stood and moved to the door, but then turned back to Milana.
How could you do this, after what they did to your home all those years ago?
Milana looked away, a small bit of shame finally showing.
I knew what they were capable of, what they could do. To you.
Zelda sighed in resignation. There would be no reaching this misguided girl.
You are to leave Kageno in 2 days' time, and never return.
The girl's face dropped. She shook her head at the stable girl again.
No one will trust you now,
she said. Zelda left the cell, pledging that to be the last time she ever looked upon Milana's face. In the weeks since returning to Kageno with Impa, routine had returned as well for most of the residents. Homes were being rebuilt, children were going back to school, and life was resembling how it used to look. But not for Zelda. For her, Garen's absence was even more starkly noticed as the days drew on. She stayed far from his burnt-down shop and packed away the kunai blades he had gifted her, so she would not look upon them. She also had not yet confessed to Impa what she knew of her destiny, still sussing out how to approach it, unsure of the best way. As she and Roven sat in the grotto on a cloudy morning, she decided to ask for his advice. This was not her normal way, and she felt awkward and silly, but Roven had proven to be a true friend. She needed to trust him more, and wanted to bring him into her emotional orbit more often. But she refused to take advantage of him again. She would not allow herself to be selfish any longer. There was relief in explaining what she knew to him, and she was honest about how it made her feel.
She won't be able to have a family, Roven. She won't be able to live her life, not the way she deserves to. I don't know how to tell her. It will bring her world crashing down.
Roven frowned, his hazel eyes narrowed. He looked to be thinking something, but wouldn't say it.
What? Tell me your honest thoughts. I need help. You know how hard it is for me to admit that.
Zelda, I don't think you're fearing Impa's life crashing down.
You don't?
He shook his head. I think you're fearing your own. She shifted uncomfortably.
I don't know what you mean.
But she was lying. She did know. Roven took her hand in his. I accepted it when you left on your journey, he said. That you and we'd never make this into something more. But now you've found your destiny. That you're a sage, too. Which means...
I can't have a family either.
Her eyes filled with tears, and she fell onto Roven's shoulder. She sobbed out the emotions she'd been holding in since gaining all the knowledge she had. The knowing that her duty to Hyrule would overtake any hope for a personal future. It wasn't just Impa. It was both of them. Wherever you end up, Zelda, I'm going to come see you, Roven said. She lifted her head to look at him.
How? What if I'm holed up in a temple? Somewhere you can't get to? What if I never see you or Impa or Telma again? When my mission is over, when I'm finished helping Link, I don't know what will happen to me.
I'll find a way, you know me. I'm not gonna give up. He gave her his classic goofy smile, and I know what's gonna happen to you. You're gonna do amazing things. You're gonna be the person I look up to, like you always have been. Zelda's tears continued to fall, but the sad ones mixed with happy. She hugged her friend, the truest friend she'd ever known, she realized, and thanked the goddesses for him. Zelda sat across from Impa in the empty dining room, her expression apprehensive. What was she going to say? Would she say anything? There was no reaction thus far, just a passive indifference. Zelda grew more and more nervous the longer the silent seconds drew by.
Impa,
She said.
are you alright? You can tell me.
Impa slowly let a smile spread across her face.
I am honored.
She said, true emotion filling her voice.
Thank you for telling me, Zelda. I could not think of a better way to find out.
The princess frowned in confusion.
You're okay with this? You do know what this means, don't you? Impa, you can't plan for a future. No family, no friends, no life. You'll be stuck in that treacherous shadow temple with no one but yourself to keep you company.
She knew the words she spoke were harsh, but Impa deserved the truth. That place was a literal torture chamber. Kage wanted to transform it, but was murdered before he could. Zelda feared that Impa's chance to do the same would also be stolen from her, along with her life. Impa only chuckled.
Princess, I understand what I'll be giving up, but I have a life now, and I am living it because of you. Because you saw fit to rescue me from the King of Evil. You have given me the life I have always dreamed of. And when my time comes, it comes. I will accept my duty to Hyrule, just as you have. Do you even realize how inspiring you are? What?
She didn't understand. How could Impa be so unconcerned?
I was so proud when you decided to seek your own training. Perhaps I did not show it to you, and that is my failing. But I am telling you now, I watched you grow into the most capable young girl. A girl who took on every challenge she could, who proved herself every day. You, have become worthy of being a sage at your young age of 15. Not only that, but of having possession of the Triforce of Wisdom.
Zelda gaped at her.
You have shown me how to be the best sage I could ever be. You are my role model, Zelda.
More tears. She couldn't take more tears, even if they were good ones. But fall they did. Impa took her hand from across the table.
Don't ever forget how special you are. You may think I've taught you a lot, or that Garon did, or even the sages you met. But Zelda, you have taught each and every one of us more than we could ever teach you. I don't know what to say.
She wiped her eyes and took a breath.
But there is more, Impa. Perhaps you should not be so inspired by me, because I'm fearful and selfish. You're right. I'm a sage too, which means I'll suffer the same fate, having to give all of myself to this duty and give up my life.
Impa narrowed her eyes in retrospection.
I wouldn't assume so much, Princess. What do you mean? You have a piece of the Triforce. That makes you different from the rest of the sages. And once Ganondorf is defeated, someone has to lead Hyrule, don't they?
Someone did have to lead Hyrule. She was the only member of the royal family left. The only one left to take the crown.
We shall see what happens to the both of us when the time comes. But for now, let us live the lives we have. Yes?
Zelda smiled hesitantly.
All right.
She agreed.
But in the meantime, how do you feel about training me again? More than you already have been, I mean.
Impa laughed.
It would be an honor to train you again. In fact,
She brought from her pocket a curious-looking tree nut.
this is a Deku nut. I found it on the ground in the Gerudo prison, and I want to teach you how to use it. To disappear.
The long road called to her. It had been 2.5 years since Zelda's last journey. Kami galloped as though time was running out. And well, one could say it was. But this time she had much more control over how things would play out. The goddess harp rested on her back, a place it had become accustomed to. They had a sort of relationship, she and the harp. They'd gotten to know each other well while she sought out the ancient sages, and they'd been bonded ever since. It had been through a bit of a ringer though, having been dropped and stepped on numerous times. Off-white fabric wrapped around a fracture in the wood, a wound that would never heal. But the harp still played, and now, as she rode toward Hyrule one last time, she could feel its excitement. It was finally time. Link would be waking soon, and Sheik would be there to guide him. As she rode, her thoughts drifted to the past few days, the goodbyes she'd had. Roven had been especially saddened, though he covered it up with humor. He had made her promise to use the compass if she needed to, though she didn't have the heart to tell him she wouldn't. Hyrule was as familiar to her as Kageno now was. Its map lived inside her mind, and she would have no trouble traversing it. But she promised him anyway, and he promised her again that he would visit, once this was all over. She still wasn't entirely sure what would happen when the time came, but in the last few years, she and Roven had grown their friendship into something a little more special. Undefined still, yes, but special. Telma, her skirts rustling and her bosom squishing Zelda into a fierce hug, made her promise to eat 3 full meals a day, even if she was tracking Link to the ends of the earth. And Impa? Well, Impa had given Zelda some advice. Advice the princess and sage had been contemplating for days now.
He will be lost.
Impa said to her.
Link will not know what to do with himself when he has done his duty. He will be a child trapped in a man's body, unable to reconcile the childhood he did not live through. How am I to help him?
Zelda had asked, because Impa was right. It was an unfair and terrible fate to face.
You must let him live it,
she had replied. Zelda had not understood that, not at first, but it began to make sense as she considered the words.
I cannot,
she had exclaimed.
Impa, I'll lose him.
Impa had taken Zelda's face in her hands with sympathy.
You'll lose him either way.
Now, as she thought about the consequences of sending Link back to his childhood with the Ocarina of Time, she shuddered. It would be her last step, and while Link would remember every single detail of whatever he was fated to go through, at least he would be able to live his lost childhood, to grow and mature into a true adult, to experience life as it was meant to be experienced. It would be the best possible outcome. Maybe not for her, but for him. Lake Hylia rose into view from behind the hills in front of her. As she had suspected, it had almost completely emptied now. She summoned every ounce of strength she possessed and pushed Kami into an even harder gallop, veering away from the lake and toward Hyrule Field. The Temple of Time, nestled in the outskirts of Castletown, was still wreathed in darkness, just like in the very first vision Rauru had sent her. She rode past the redeads littering the square, wondering who they had been in life, and then shut the thought out of her mind. She entered the temple, listening to the echo of her steps and gazing at the sparkling spiritual stones that still rested at the altar. Master Sword's empty pedestal stood, stoic as ever, as she entered the chamber, once a guarded secret now left open. She positioned herself behind it and waited. It took only minutes. A blue column of light suddenly rippled itself into view, and as it dissipated, an older Link, all dressed in green, and a fairy following him, stepped out of it, gripping the Master Sword in his left hand and glowing a determined aura. He stepped away, having not yet seen her.
I've been waiting for you,
she said quietly. He turned in surprise, his eyes as wide as they were when she saw him by the drawbridge all those years ago. The same boy looked out from those eyes, the same innocence, and she felt the distance between her and the boy in green grow.
Hero of time,
She continued.
I am Sheik.
Epilogue. After the events of Ocarina of Time. The Queen of Hyrule sat at the throne while a resident of Kakariko Village informed her of an issue with the farm animals. Some were falling ill, mostly the sheep, and some of the cuckoos. No humans were affected, however, which puzzled the farmer, and so he could not come up with a solution. They discussed at length a potential resolution while her castle guards looked on. Once the man was satisfied, he left with a bow, thanking Queen Zelda for her enduring empathy. 3 months had passed since she had helped Link seal Ganondorf into the Sacred Realm, where he would sleep indefinitely, unable to cause chaos in their world any longer. Link hadn't wanted to go back to his childhood, and in all honesty, she almost granted him that wish. But her conscience won out. She explained that she had made a mistake all those years ago bringing Link into this whole mess, that every decision she had made since then had been to ensure he would remain safe and able to claim his fate. And once he did, she had to make things right. In the end, he relented, and he gave her the Ocarina of Time, an instrument which she hadn't held in so very long, and she had sent him home. Since that destined day, her future, which for her entire life she was certain was destined to be sad and lonely without Link in it, had turned out not to be so terrible. Rauru had sent her one last vision, ensuring her that she could take the crown and rule her land of Hyrule without fear of being shut behind a shadowy door. She had slowly recruited talent for her queen's court, including soldiers to again guard the sprawling castle. She had made allies with every race, including the Gerudo. She ensured that every single newly called sage had what they needed at all times. After everything she had seen and done, it was important to her, and every now and again she visited the Shadow Temple for a little training from Impa. Though she remained the only member of the royal family of Hyrule, it seemed that the path of shadow she had taken to get here had led her just a little closer to the light. Queen Zelda, one of her soldiers said, interrupting her thoughts, which had kept her staring into space. There is one more visitor, though not by appointment. Shall I send him in?
Yes, Hyrule. Please do.
She was determined to be a good queen, one that all of her subjects could depend on. If that meant staying up a little past her bedtime in order to take requests for help, she would do it. She shook out her tired limbs and sat tall on the throne. The doors opened, and Haro returned with,
Revan!
Zelda leapt from her throne, forgetting all about decorum. She jumped into a hug and Rovan spun her around, her dress fanning out. She still hadn't quite gotten used to wearing gowns again. Sometimes she secretly wished she could wear her chic gear instead. She had learned to appreciate how well it had served her after all. What a change from the frightened little girl who felt only devastation at having to wear the getup. They separated, both smiling ear to ear. It was the first time she had seen him since she left to guide Link. She had sent a letter to him, ensuring that she was all right and free, and while she hadn't written it explicitly in the letter, she knew she was also free to be with anyone she wished. It was the only thought that could occur to her now, as she gazed into his hazel eyes full of mischief. Rowan moved a piece of her hair out of her face, and she flushed. She felt suddenly embarrassed, wishing for her face wraps to hide her, and wasn't sure what to say, so she let him speak first instead. He smiled at her, searching her eyes like he used to, and whispered, "There you are." The light in the Chamber of Sages, where Rauru not only guarded the Temple of Light, but also Ganondorf's beast form, a sleeping giant sealed away in a frozen jewel, seemed to shudder for a moment. The light here never did that. Not unless something had infiltrated the realm.
Show yourself,
he said to the air, knowing that it was not just air that now took up the space. A white light burst into view, a light only a goddess could emit. Once Rauru could adjust his eyes, he gazed at the pure, indescribable beauty of the goddess Hylia, a radiant being made of light. She had only ever visited this temple once before, and that was when Rauru was given his task of setting the princess and the hero on their paths. But back then, she had only spoken to him, and had not shown herself. He had seen nothing like this before. She surpassed the beauty of the Temple of Light itself. He bowed in reverence.
It is my honor to witness your power, Goddess Hylia.
You have done well, Sage of Light, to honor my wishes. The princess sits the throne, and the hero walks a path in a different time, one separate from our own. A line of time that branched away. This is the destiny that shall shape the future worlds.
There are branches of time?
Rauru asked. This was new information.
Indeed, timelines that go their own way and create new possibilities. It is necessary, for this, Hyrule, is not long for this world. You have seen to it.
For the first time, wisest Rauru, Sage of Light, felt confusion fill him up.
Please explain, Goddess Hylia. I have simply performed as you asked me. Was I not saving Hyrule?
Hyrule was always meant to drown.
Hylia said.
It is the only destiny it had. Until you set the princess on her path. This has made it possible for these lands to endure in another time, on another branch.
But not here, he asked. He felt a sting inside his chest, a sorrow he had only ever felt once before, when the ancient sages, his friends and companions, had been murdered.
It is the destiny of this land, and in order for it to come to pass, you must perform one last task.
He waited, a sinking feeling growing inside him.
In 100 years, you must release the King of Evil into the world again.